Alrighty. Okay, I think we can get started. Hope everyone's excited for this wonderful session this afternoon. Well, good afternoon and welcome, officially welcome everyone. I am Jamia Kinsey Singleton. I am chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee and also president-elect for PRSA New Jersey. Thank you for attending today's webinar. We are excited to bring the series of Lunch and Learn webinars on courageous conversations to help put diversity and inclusion into action. This is actually our third webinar in this series. We had one back in August on privilege in the workplace, and then we had our last one last month on what it means to be an ally. So hopefully some of you all were able to join those. If not, we do have them all recorded, so you can always go back and take a look at those afterwards. And this session today is being recorded as well. The goal for today's session is for us to learn more about building and retaining diverse teams, and to leave the session better equipped to take actions in our personal and professional lives. And we have some amazing panelists today, so I can't wait for you all to hear from them and get all the wonderful insights and lessons and tools that they will be sharing with us today to really, again, put these tools and things into action. This webinar series is in partnership with the New Jersey YMCA State Alliance. We would like to thank Darren Anderson, Teresa Williams, and the rest of the entire YMCA team for your support and for being an amazing partner. Thank you. I would also like to give special thanks to PRSA New Jersey, our board of directors, and to my fellow D&I committee members. We have Keisha Dabrowski, Lanella Hooper Williams, Deirdre Lopian, and today's moderator, Stephanie K. Reed. Stephanie is the Director of Communications for Finance and Administration at Rutgers University. And before I turn it over to Stephanie, we have a few things to note. Again, this session is being recorded. A few housekeeping things. Everyone has been placed on mute by the host. If you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function. If you want to talk amongst each other, then please use the chat for that. But again, if you have questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, please use the Q&A function, and we will make sure that we address those questions at the end of the webinar. And then also, like we said, we'll hold about 10 to 15 minutes to do that at the end of the session to make sure that all questions are answered. Also, we want to note that, let's see here. We also want to note next, in terms of participation, so this is a safe space. So we want to make sure that people respectfully express their opinions and to have those opinions respected by others. So as you're putting things in the chat or asking questions, please be mindful of all of this and make sure that we're just respectful for one another. So Stephanie, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you all again so very much for joining our webinar today.
Great, thank you, Jamia. October is splendid for many reasons, like it's Diversity and Inclusion Month. And this year, PRSA's D&I Month theme is Transforming the Landscape, and that's exactly what we're here to discuss today. Courageous conversations require awareness and vulnerability, determination and creativity to take action on issues of injustice and inequity that have plagued this country and predate its founding. 2020 continues to drag us through transformative and sometimes devastating life events, a global health pandemic, a reckoning of racial injustices, a polarizing political climate, and an economic crisis. And in the past several months, millions of people have become unexpectedly employed. So while that may lead many to think that now is not the best time for this discussion, it is. We owe it to our future selves to strategize how our organizations will attract, hire, retain, develop, and advance diverse talent. So our goals for today are that you learn something new, that you leave this conversation with a more open mind, and that you identify at least one thing that you can do to dismantle the structures that support bias and discrimination in the workplace. So allow me to introduce you to our brilliant panelists. We're joined today by Nponano Maikori, the Communications and Talent Manager at Local Wisdom, Joel Pacheco, the founder of Talentum Global Consulting, and Stephanie Scott is the Senior Vice President at Wayside Communications. So to begin with the same understanding about how to interpret diversity, I'll refer to the 2020 PRSA D&I Chapter Toolkit. The most obvious contexts of diversity include race, ethnicity, religion, age, ability, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, country of origin, culture, and diversity of thought. However, in a rapidly changing society, diversity continues to evolve and can include class, socioeconomic status, life experiences, learning and work styles, personality types, and intellectual traditions and perspectives, in addition to cultural, political, religious, and other beliefs. So with that in mind, we're going to start today's conversation with a brief poll to gauge where you and your organizations are with respect to today's topic. So in a moment, you'll see the poll appear on your screen. We have a total of 6 questions, and then I'll give you a few minutes to look through them, and then we'll talk about the results. So our topics today are focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, mentoring, sponsoring, and succession planning, and psychological safety. So we have some responses coming in. We're just going to give people a little bit of time. And just another maybe 15 or so seconds. All right, great. You can continue to put your results in. It looks like we're getting another surge. But it's great to see that we have, of the results that we do have, that a majority of people, 72%, have diversity, equity, and inclusion named as a part of your organization's mission or values. A whopping 92% can name more than one diverse person on your team, and hopefully these diversity contexts helped you define that and give broader range of thought to what diversity means. Looks like there's about a total of 40% of people who are aware of mentoring programs, but not so much on the sponsorships, just 2%. Diverse leadership, so an affirmative 65%. 54% of people believe that their organization has an inclusive culture where people feel psychologically safe to address D&I topics. Those of you who have answered not sure, it would be great if you could put comments into the chat about what that means. If you're not comfortable doing that, that's totally okay. It would just help us think through some of the conversation this morning, but I understand that that's not a topic that you're willing to discuss in that forum. And then finally, we'll take a look at some of the barriers. It looks like the greatest barrier is a lack of dedicated resources, and it's great to see that 25% of the people who responded feel that there are no barriers. Oh, great. Okay, we can close the survey. Great. So implicit and explicit biases and discrimination continue to obstruct diverse talent from entering the workforce and advancing at a pace that's comparable to those who exercise their privilege and historically have held the majority of entry, mid-level, and leadership positions. So I'll ask the panel, as people whose roles span communications, talent acquisition and development, and executive leadership, please share your perspectives on overlooked and underestimated approaches to recruiting diverse talent that you've had success with. So you'll see the question on your screen. How have you led or counseled organizations to be intentional about developing and executing strategies to recruit diverse talent? So Joel, maybe we'll start with you.
Right. Well, again, thank you. It's really an honor to be part of the panel. You know, in my experience, I've always looked to teams and I've said to them, well, are you building teams that are representative of the folks walking out on the street? And are you looking at diversity within your teams as an opportunity to really drive for greater success? Nowadays with RFPs, the question about diversity on teams was just kind of a check mark, provide some data. Now organizations and brands, businesses throughout media and throughout advertising, a field that I'm really close with, are now asking a lot more questions and are actually wanting to meet the teams that are going to work on their accounts and are looking for diversity. So the first thing is, are you really representative within your own teams of the folks walking out in the streets in the cities or in the towns that you're in?
So I can jump in. Again, thank you guys for joining today. Thank you for having me. I can say that just based off of my experience, I think one of the things that, I do from our perspective at Local Wisdom, and then also what we do with our clients when we're recruiting for team members that are going to support the work that they're doing and the work that we have internally as well, is, I've always kind of believed that with that recruiting space, when you take a holistic view of it, there's a lot of really critical components in recruiting that we kind of, a lot of times don't think make an impact in the type of talent that we get for certain positions. And so one of the things I've done when I first started kind of taking over this piece of it for us was looking at the job descriptions. I think a lot of times job descriptions can be really outdated and they can be very, descriptive in a way that I think people sometimes look at it and they say, oh, I don't have these qualifications. So one of the things that we were looking at when we started looking at job descriptions is there a way that we can use certain words to kind of entice a different type of audience than the audience that we're getting? A lot of times when we post for roles, I can tell within the first 2 days, just based off of the applicants, if I need to go back in and retool that job description just a little bit, because maybe I'm not necessarily getting the type of pool that I want in that moment. I think that a lot of it too, a lot of companies are starting to use AI in that recruiting process. And the problem with AI sometimes is that you're limited to the types of information that it's going to give you back on each of these candidates. So for me, what I've started doing, and it's tedious and it's time consuming, and for me being the only person that does talent and recruiting within our organization, I do start to go through the resumes myself. So I put an eye on every resume that ever gets submitted. And while most recruiters probably don't have that kind of time to sit there and go through every single resume that comes in, I find that whenever I focus on keywords or key skills or key attributes, that I miss out on potentially having that diverse talent that may not necessarily fit into the box of what it is we're looking for in that moment, but because I've actually put an eye to it and I know what I'm looking for from a skill set perspective. I know kind of what some of those tertiary skills are that would play a role into this person being a great fit or asset to our company. That's why I do it that way. I think that, for a lot of organizations, you probably need to have someone or a team, depending on the size of your organization, that could be dedicated to actually being able to kind of look through those resumes and those job descriptions on an individual basis.
And I'd like to add, and thank you everyone for being here today and for having me today. Some of the observations I've had is it really starts with the business case. It should be the right thing to do, but sometimes really convincing an organization, particularly a larger one, to be intentional is around having them understand how diverse talent really adds to what they could be doing better. Either that's for understanding and connecting with customer bases differently, in the healthcare space, having a different eye to patients, diverse talent across the board, and organizations that are diverse, survey after survey have shown are much more profitable. And that sometimes is a very convincing argument for organizations to change what they're doing and be very intentional about seeking diverse voices and peoples around the table.
That's a great point. The intentionality and the business case Also, that translates right into some of what we'll talk about next, which is development. Right? So being intentional about investing in an employee's growth is vital to retention. Getting people in the door is one thing, but being able to continue to keep them engaged and want to be a part of the organization is something entirely different. And so this can manifest in various ways that demonstrate reciprocal benefits for both the individual and their company. So an organization's capacity to personalize development programs and encourage mentor and sponsorship relationships and to develop leaders through effective succession planning is crucial to validating an individual's value and having that diverse talent in the organization. This also is an area where allies can further amplify their colleagues' voices and illuminate their knowledge and experience. So what should managers and organizations do proactively and consistently to shape D&I strategies through mentoring, sponsorship, and succession planning?
First, so organizations first need to actually have succession planning as a process, right? So there's a lot of planning around, let's do strategic planning, let's do year-end planning. Well, what about actually saying, let's do our succession planning and dedicate time and also training so that people understand, managers understand what succession planning really means. And I think there's also, organizations need to be able to identify individuals within the organization that want to be mentors, that are willing to spend, I call it the political capital, to actually invest in wanting to mentor individuals, diverse individuals within the organization and even outside of the organization, to kind of take them to the next level and bring them along. But I think it all starts with organizations having a real true succession planning process that is dedicated and supported from the top and driven down throughout the entire organization. You can't just put out their succession planning and really not communicate it, not involve mentors that are senior level mentors that are willing to be engaged and willing to take risks and make commitments on making the program successful.
Yeah, to Joel's point, I think that, what you're starting to see now more and more within organizations is that they're starting to kind of build out that D&I team within their org. So a lot of companies actually have a diversity and inclusion head or team that's focused solely on doing that type of work. And so to Joel's point, I think that part of it is the strategy, right? So you have to have at least a strategy of some sort in place before all of this stuff kind of falls into place. I think that as an organization, you have to be committed to investing in mentoring and, to the political capital point. Yeah, you want sponsors and mentors who are fully vested in the success of that team member. But on the flip side of that, you want to make sure that you're encouraging your employees, that they have that available to them. I think a lot of times it's easy to say that, hey, we have a mentoring program, and based off of the fact that maybe they haven't seen it successfully in action, a lot of employees may say, well, what am I going to get out of this? Like, how do I know it's not just going to be a waste of my time? The senior leader may say that he's signing up, but I've worked with them in the past and maybe I know how they are, and this is just something else that they're going to blow off. So I think that while you're getting that buy-in from the mentors, you also have to get that buy-in from the mentees, because again, without having a true strategy in place, what is to convince people that they're going to benefit from actually being mentored by somebody within your organization? And what's the incentive for the mentor to actually see this person's development through? I think a lot of times it's easy to just kind of put it on a box and say, hey, everybody's goals are tied into this. Your bonus at the end of the year is tied into how many diverse candidates you interview or how many people you put in this position or in this place. But, there has to be targeted metrics and results that you're actually looking for when you implement something like this. So I think a lot of it is around the strategy and making it beneficial to everybody participating.
And I'd like to add, mentor and mentoring are verbs, and there has to be a very proactive approach, especially, I believe, with diverse talent. And this, in some ways, goes back to privilege in the workplace. Some mentees may not understand fully how to tap into those relationships to the best of their abilities, and you really need to choose mentors who are not sitting back and waiting for questions to be asked, but really understand the role, really understand that they need to lean into it a little bit more, really are able to create a culture and environment where the barriers are lowered in a way that their mentees feel comfortable opening up and engaging around a variety of topics for those relationships to work. And so that selection and understanding on the role and how it may play out differently sometimes with diverse employees is very important.
Great. So as we talk about inclusion and begin to think through organizations where people feel psychologically safe, and we did see in the poll a few moments ago that some people aren't sure what that means, and another group of people feel like their organizations are places where people feel psychologically safe and can have conversations around DE&I topics. Some of that belongs with the topic of belonging, right? In order for someone to feel like they're in a safe space, they need to feel a sense of community and that they have each other's back, right? So people head to work every day to handle their business, but also to be a part of a larger community. We all want to be seen and heard and appreciated. And as I mentioned, we want to be motivated and have deeper connections to organizational values. It was great to see that so many people who completed the poll also have diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of their overall mission and values. And hopefully there is some correlation between the people who answered positively to that and the organizations where people feel like they have a safe space to work in. Well, there's definitely no shortcut to consciously nurturing an inclusive culture where marginalized populations are welcome and uplifted, creating that environment where people's worldviews are expanded, their interactions and colleagues require some cultural competence and a willingness to learn and grow, sometimes incrementally, sometimes exponentially. So I would love to hear, and I'm sure our guests would love to hear what you've created, what you've experienced in terms of psychologically safe and inclusive workspaces, and specifically, why was it effective?
So I know for me, when I first started, one of the things that had been on, our executive team's agenda for a while was kind of like employee satisfaction survey. They hadn't done one in a while, and it was one of those things where we were in a position where we really needed to kind of understand, from an organizational standpoint, where we were with our internal teams. And so from that survey, I think that a part of it, why those surveys are crucial is because, you're building a component of trust. And so for me, one of the things that was imperative right from the very beginning was that I needed to give people a safe space. As somebody who was kind of tasked with overseeing employee engagement, they had to feel that if nothing else, they had somebody who was always going to be an ear and ally for them whenever they were wanting to kind of feel that safe space. And so through the surveys, I was able to reach out to everybody on the team individually. I spoke to every single employee that we had about some of the results and some of the responses that they made, and kind of really got to the root of why they shared what they shared. And then I was able to take that back to our CEO and COO and talk to them about some of those issues and some of those challenges that the teams were having. And so I think from that, for us to be able to put together a strategy on how to address some of those key issues and some of those overarching issues, and to actually, for the team to actually see some of that stuff start to get implemented, I think started to give them more of kind of, to that point, that feeling of nurture and, hey, you know what, these guys really have my best interest at heart. They're really concerned about me as an employee and as a team member. And so we started to build that trust in that way. And so I think that we're at the point now where, especially when the George Floyd situation happened, we had a conversation immediately as a team. We had a meeting, and we talked through it, and we gave everybody the opportunity to share how they were feeling in that moment. Because the one thing that you do recognize in times like this is that it's going to take everybody, not just a diverse segment, to address a problem or an issue. It takes everyone, allies as well. And so for us, for our diverse team members to have our white counterparts also be on that call and also participating and also being able to hear and acknowledge some of that pain and some of that, that anguish that we were feeling was super important. And I think that it also helped kind of catapult us to another level of trust internally that, you know, we've been slowly inching towards. So
I think my experiences in various organizations, including the one that I'm in now, is really been the top-down leadership commitment that this is important. And it's everything from those small moments, like being able to stop and acknowledge, for example, the George Floyd situation that happened over the summer, to longer term commitments, but really having leadership that not only acknowledges the importance and holds people accountable for the importance, but also leadership that's representative of all types of diversity, and that those people are acknowledged. You know, representation matters, and being in organizations where you can look at boards and executive teams and others in positions is very impactful across the landscape of diversity for people to understand where they fit in, and that they do fit in and have contributions to make to organizations.
Yeah, I mean, to build on that, I also, you know, one of the things that I find that's very empowering is when you celebrate the diversity within the organization and invite folks from within the organization to sit on panels to talk about their experiences. Because, you know, you take someone who's sitting in that audience that will connect with someone's experience on someone's journey. And that really makes a difference, because it does make people feel that they can come to work and be themselves, right? Bring their entire self to work. And I really can't say enough about the need to develop, organizations need to really spend more time thinking about it, much like they do, again, you know, developing a strategy for the business. Well, what's, as part of your diversity and equality and inclusion strategy, is bringing in people from the outside that can participate in these meetings and kind of bring a new perspective and experience to the workplace, so that your own employees can connect and feel that they can bring themselves to work wholly.
So how have you, and this question is for any of the panelists, how have you specifically been involved in a workplace? I know Nponano gave us a great example, but been in a situation in a workplace, and I'm going to even take us back to the second question around development, where you either benefited from being in a mentoring relationship, where you were sponsored by someone, or where you sponsored someone.
So I've done both. So, you know, in a previous role, the person, my hiring manager, actually, one of the, you know, things that she told me after they hired me was that, because there was two of them, was that the other manager actually wasn't sold on me, but that there was something in me that she recognized at the time and wanted to kind of help see and develop that. She was always my biggest advocate. She was always my biggest cheerleader. I got to see on a day-to-day, just kind of shadowing her and the different things that she did within kind of her leadership position. I got to see, you know, firsthand some of those attributes and some of those skills that I had always admired in leaders, but not necessarily knew how I could get myself there. And she took me under her wing and she guided me in that way. And I think that a lot of how I approach things now is because of some of those core values that, you know, I witnessed and observed her doing in her day-to-day. You know, that transitioned into me being able to mentor, you know, in a previous role. And I'm doing it now with my team here as well, as you know, because I interact with them on a day-to-day, so I'm aware of the things that they excel at, and I'm aware of the areas of opportunity that they have to kind of improve within their given roles. And so one of the things that I do when we have our one-on-ones is talk through some of those things that they may not necessarily do all that well, and give them insight into, if I were in that position, kind of how I would approach it, and then give them the ability to kind of solution towards it based off of that information. So I think that, I think the best mentors are probably people who have been mentored in the past and who have been able to kind of realize, their potential through the eyes of someone else.
I think the best advice, I've also had the experience of being in both situations, but I think the best advice that I've gotten from a mentor was to be myself. And a lot of those conversations and discussions were about the energy that it takes to be inauthentic. And when you are inauthentic and you are spending that energy, not being your true self, it becomes a drain in a lot of different ways in terms of how you show up. And having a mentor who really helped to teach me how to be myself. It was okay to be myself, being in a safe place. That authenticity matters, and that's part of why I was hired into that particular role. That was like a weight being lifted off, and I think especially for people who aspire to leadership roles or in organizations where that is something that's a possibility or interest for them. Some of the best leaders across the board are their authentic selves, and you really open up so much potential in people when you spend time, mentoring them and fostering that development in a way that all of their talents are really brought to the table in unique ways for the organization.
Yeah, and I have a similar story as well, because for me, I was a mentee, and my mentor earlier on in my career, instilled in me this sense of come and be yourself. Being yourself is your greatest strength, because that's going to open more doors and more opportunities for you if you're genuine, right? Live within your own, own yourself, own your own being genuine to yourself. And that's why I think being a mentor, and I've been a mentor for quite a few people, is to really kind of share that and to kind of say it's okay to come to work and bring yourself to work, because you bring such experience being yourself that is going to make you more unique and is going to make the workplace environment far more inclusive.
So we heard a comment earlier regarding training. And I just want to touch on that for just a minute. So there are, in just about every organization I have been in, there's been some conversation around people who are put in the position of being people managers who have never been one before. And I have yet to come across an effective first-time manager orientation or training. It typically just doesn't happen that way. It's not been my experience. But I would like to hear from the panelists around what you have seen that is effective in terms of the training that could be available for a manager. Because I think one of the things that people who are first-time managers of any size team struggle with is how to be a good manager. And a part of that includes sometimes being a mentor or being a sponsor for that individual, right? Sometimes the person you need is the person that's closest to you. Sometimes they're far over their shoulder. The other aspect of training, though, that I'd like to hear from you about is on diversity and inclusion. And so where there are people who don't have a diversity and inclusion office or resource within their organization, what options do you recommend for them?
I'll jump in with options for people who don't have those opportunities within their organizations. There's everything from diverse chapters of trade and professional groups across the board, alumni related organizations, I would really try to seek out some other types of networks that have those diverse arms or representations. For example, in the pharma industry, women of color in pharma, or you know, other types of groups, because sometimes you get the information, the advice, the support, the career connections, resources from some of these different types of organizations than you would internally. Even if you have those resources internally, I would encourage seeking out those types of organizations.
You know, I think for a very long time, organizations kind of promoted people into roles, into manager roles, and they kind of just threw them into the deep end and said, well, you either sink or swim. And setting up someone for failure is no way to help anyone, right? No one wants to fail. So I think the first thing is the organization needs to commit to having that person with a mentor, someone that's either done that role in the past or is more senior in the organization and is willing to mentor that individual. Secondly, I think that, you know, the organization needs to make training available, and it needs to not be kind of, you know, just pick something. It needs to be something that's kind of laid out. You know, one of the things that I've seen be very successful is when you look at someone and when you look at an opportunity and you say, well, in order for someone to be promoted into this manager role, they need to take the following courses. And it could be, you know, courses through LinkedIn Learning that's then followed up by actual, actual practice. It could be through, you know, Harvard Business Review articles. It can be through books. I mean, it's all about the education. And I think that needs to be made available to an employee, because again, setting someone up to be successful is the most critical key in order to make someone feel that they are going to be able to do the job the way it should be done.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, there's a few things that Jill just said that kind of triggered a response for me. And I think that whether you're in an organization that can afford a full-on investment into training or not, I think that for any organization, if you tie your leadership training into your organization's goals and strategies, you're already putting yourself in a position to kind of understand and know what type of leaders you're trying to develop. Secondly, I think that there's a component of that, you know, you have to make sure that you identify the right training content. So you need to know, as you're promoting these people into these different leadership positions, exactly what it is they're going to be doing within that role, and making sure that the content that they're learning from that training standpoint ties into that, and that you're actually setting them up to be able to successfully manage that function. I think some of those other skills, they start to kind of, you know, you build them out as you have more experience and exposure to it. But I think that you also have to have a mechanism for measuring and evaluating kind of the results of that training. So, you know, as you're, again, if you're tying it into your goals and your strategies, that's also probably tying into performance management and some of those other areas that you'll be able to tell at the end of that, you know, maybe 9-month period or 12-month period, how this person is doing as a manager. And then you'll also be able to see what areas you need to focus on to build out that next level for that individual.
Thank you. So I have just one more question, and then we will transition to Q&A. It looks like we have a lot of questions that have come in through the chat and through the Q&A directly to the panelists. So if we think back to the mounting crises and the uncertainty that I referred to at the beginning of today's talk, it's understandable that people may be impatient and eager to make progress toward having more meaningful DEI initiatives. So what are your closing thoughts for our guests who might be saying, okay, this is all great, but what now?
So I think it's first asking what is the organization's strategy, right? What is their, how are they approaching diversity, equality, and inclusion? You know, I always say data tells you everything, right? And employees have every right to ask their organization, where do we stand? Like, what are the numbers? What do we look like as an organization? Because that's the way you're going to be able to start a conversation around, does this seem like we're heading in the right direction? You know, going back to my opening kind of comment was about, are we representing on our teams and within our organization the people that are walking out in the streets? And are we really building a team that is diverse, or are we continuing to hire in our own image? And by doing that, taking away from our ability to actually be a better organization. And so I think it starts with asking the question, what is the organization's strategy? 2, great, but what can you share with us the numbers? And let's have a frank and meaningful conversation as an organization, and set the path that the organization needs to take in order to become a more diverse organization.
Yeah, and I think another element is calling things out when they happen. It's difficult to change a culture, and it doesn't just happen in committees or with a few people. And being able to recognize and acknowledge the parts that are broken and deal with it on the spot. For example, I think about the use of recruiters, and if you're not getting diverse slates of candidates from your recruiters, hold them accountable. Be very specific and intentional about what you are looking for, what you're asking for, and if they tell you they can't do it or they can't find it, you probably need to find another recruiter. You know, other things, being able to, you know, create the environment and culture, which it boils down to, the willingness to hear and address things quickly, and not let them simmer, is absolutely critical. When people understand that issues that concern them in the workplace are taken seriously and quickly, it is very powerful, and it really speaks to the commitment and the culture that there's a willingness to make the kind of change that's important and lasting.
Yeah, I think that there has to be a level of an autopsy probably that needs to happen for most organizations. I think that, you know, someone made or alluded to the point earlier that it starts from the top down. And I think that, you know, when you start looking at some of these large companies and some of these mid-sized companies, and they have their white male CEO at the helm, I think that part of where these conversations have to begin is with those board members and with those executive leadership people within these organizations, really wanting to make the commitment to it. And I think that happens if you have enough people who are willing to kind of call it out. You know what I mean? I read somewhere recently where somebody had made the comment, or the Wells Fargo CEO, I think, had made the comment about the fact that the reason they weren't hiring diverse talent is because they weren't finding qualified talent. And so, you know, to Stephanie's point about recruiting, I think that if these recruiters aren't made to believe that it's a priority within that organization, they're not going to make it a priority. So from the top down, if that's his perspective, they share that perspective. Right. So there needs to be an examination as a whole into kind of how they are operating and why they're not able to find those diverse talents. I think that I've had the benefit, you know, at Local Wisdom, we're a minority-owned company. Both of our leaders are diverse. And so, you know, for them, it's never been an issue of whether or not we should make it a priority. It's a priority because they've been in that position, and they have been on the back end of that. So I think that, you know, again, it does start from the top down, but I think that if you're having a hard time as an organization, even identifying or acknowledging that it's a problem within your org, that's kind of where it starts.
Awesome, thank you. So we are going to transition to Q&A. There are a number of questions that came in directly to the panelists, and there are some that I see that are in the chat, but we'll look to get them as many answered as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. So one question that came in is, I'm curious about the E for equity that's not listed in D&I on the slide. I have clients who are struggling with the difference between equity and equality. How would you advise that equity is emphasized in strategies? Anyone who wants to answer that, please do.
Well, I think it goes back to, so equity is, equity, equality, it has to start from the top. And the conversation needs to start with a genuine conversation, whether it's about, equal pay, whether it's about equal opportunity for roles. It is something that needs to start with a clear mandate, basically from the CEO, that says, we need to open ourselves up here and discuss how, not only is diversity and inclusion important, but also how we're looking at equity within the organization and acknowledge it. I was with an organization where we would publish our bands of pay between male and female. And we would say, within these categories, within these bands, here's the delta. And where there was a delta, we said we are adjusting, and we did. And I think that sent a huge message out to the organization. Now that really takes an organization that is so self-aware, and I know not many are there, but I think you start by having that conversation and bringing those examples to the decision makers about how important it is to diversity and inclusion, to have equality and equity in there.
I think from an equity standpoint, you have to be able to kind of get that information from the source. So to that point, how are you finding what those challenges are for those team members? Where are they feeling that fairness or that lack of equivalence isn't there? To be able to kind of really understand what that plight is, I think you have to, make a concerted effort to actually talk to those individuals. So if you aren't reaching out across your organization and actually looking for examples, and you may not even have very many people who have examples, but the key is what you do with the information that you get and how you translate that into action.
Yeah. And I think that's why the employee survey, Panelists, like you mentioned, that's a great source of people will bring that up. And then it's a matter of having conversations about that and then highlighting it and saying, this is an issue, how do we address it?
Right. I think those surveys too also, and other tools help identify in the eyes of your employees what success looks like for them too. And being able to have that conversation, understand what some of the mile markers are for individuals within the organization is important to really understand what progress looks like and also what you should be targeting.
And the only thing I would caution to that end is that don't do a survey just to say that, hey, we're taking the first step and trying to hear what your thoughts are. And I have all of this information now, and I'm just going to let it sit idle because I don't have a dedicated resource to actually follow and actually strategize and put action to the survey. I think that's where you lose credibility, and then that's where you lose that trust. And then that's when you start getting stapled by the people that work for you as an organization of non-activity.
Totally. I've seen,
Totally.
I've seen companies spend thousands of dollars on a survey, third party, they get all this great data. And then I ask the question, so what did you do with it?
Nothing.
That's right. And how did you use that data to set some real concrete goals and objectives? And what's your timeline? What does the timeline look like?
Yeah.
I mean, and I think we talked about this during one of our conversations. Anytime you throw money on something, you're going to see some action. So if you tie somebody's overarching objective or goals to a bonus or to incentive pay or something to that effect to make sure that they see something like this through, they're going to jump through every possible obstacle you throw their way to make sure that they get that information and that they're actually starting to move that ball. So, you know, again, it depends on the organization and depends on what your overarching strategy is. I wanted to make sure that I threw out that don't do a survey if you have no way of moving forward with the information that you're getting.
Right.
That's right.
So we definitely have time for one more question, and I hope we can get in two and still have a couple of minutes left before the hour. The first question that I'll ask is, one of our guests said, I think this is great. However, inclusion is hard to achieve unless we find a way to dissolve the boundaries that separate us. How do we do that? How can I feel that you and I are the same?
I think one, you stop giving all of that power and decision making to one or two people. I think that, you know, at the end of the day, it's easy to say that, like, yes, maybe the CEO of my company is white, but is he the overarching? Is he the final say? If he's the final say, then what's the strategy that we're going to devise as a team to go to him to make sure that he understands that going forward, this is something that's imperative to the rest of the team that's working to make him basically look good in the CEO seat. You know, to the flip side of that, I think a lot of companies have boards that they operate and include in that decision making. What is your board comprised of? How do they look? Do they represent an equal share of everybody that's represented within your organization? If it doesn't, then again, that's where you need to push for that change to take place.
Right.
And then it looks, I just lost our last question. So how did you deal, this is a question that, again, we talked about, we touched on very quickly in the beginning. How do you deal with DEI work that stalls out when something like the COVID-19 pandemic comes about? What about stabilizing this work during times of political change in the organization? That's a great, very relevant question. Thank you.
Yeah, that is. I think it is even more critical now than ever, and that again, the priority needs to be not letting it fall on the wayside, whether it's COVID or any political, political environment, current political environment. It's making sure it still remains in the forefront. And the way that you can do that is, as an employee, ask the question, where are we with this, right? If there is something that has been published or a conversation or some dialogue where someone has committed to making this a priority, well, where did it go, right? It has to still be a priority. And I think it's participating in forums like this. I think organizations still doing greater online training to keep the conversation going, and doing these forums is really critical because we cannot let it just die. We need to keep it moving forward, and organizations need to be held accountable. Okay.
Jamia, so I thought I saw that someone had their hand raised, but I can't see it just yet.
Well, Stephanie, I know there was a question that someone asked about how important is it for a mentor to look like the mentee?
Mm-hmm.
So how important do you all think that is, or does it make a difference?
I would say,
oh, go ahead, Joel.
No, sorry, I don't think it makes a difference. I think that it's, I think what people need to know that the mentee and the mentor, the mentor is also learning something from the mentee. I've always walked away learning so much more that I think sometimes that I even gave, because I'm like, wow, I never looked at it from that perspective. I never looked at this idea. I never knew of that experience. I would not have had that experience if it hadn't been for that. So I don't necessarily think it has to be the same.
From that perspective, again, if we're trying to cultivate, right, diverse talent, I think that you want to go to whoever the best, the person in that position that's best suited to actually grow that talent. So for me, it doesn't necessarily matter if that person looks like me. If this person is in a position or in a role that I'm aspiring to be in, I'm literally there to soak up that knowledge and that information. It doesn't matter if she or he looks exactly like me or not. My sole intention for having a mentor is to develop the skills that I need to actually one day sit in that seat. So if we're talking about just learning those skills and learning what it takes to be in that seat, I don't think that the color of the person or the gender or sexual preference of that person is going to play a factor into what you're learning.
Some of the best mentors I've had have not been like me, but the mindset that they had was critical, and that made a world of difference, was the mindset.
So I think we are literally just at the hour. I really appreciate everyone's questions and your feedback. We just have a couple of things to include to make you aware of just as we close out. So we hope that today's conversation was a catalyst for you to design or redirect or accelerate your plans. And we will share the reference materials that have been curated for this event by the panelists in the coming days in an email. Before you head out, take a moment to complete the event survey. We would really love to hear your feedback. We would like to hear what you want to hear more of, what you didn't hear enough of today, and we'll look to include that in future programming. Some of what you're looking for may be included in the resources, again, which we'll share in the coming days. Later today, you will receive an email that includes a link to the survey for this event. If you subscribe to PRSANJ on YouTube, you'll be among the first to know when the recording for today's session is available. And we look forward to having you join us on November 12th for our next courageous conversation, Implicit Bias and Microaggressions in the Workplace when Good People Behave Badly. So finally, I would like to thank our exceptional panelists for their leadership, their commitment to show up and do the work to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, and thank everyone for joining us today for this courageous conversation and for celebrating D&I Month with us.
Thank you.